Hello. Yeah, I'm based in the Interaction Research Studio at Goldsmiths, and I'm going to talk today about a project called Material Beliefs. Material Beliefs was publicly funded by a UK science council. And what I really want you to consider is a speculative treatment of biotechnology coming from a kind of a design perspective, and how that moves out into the public sphere as a form of public engagement. So I'm going to give you a little bit of context on what I'm talking about here. What do I mean when I say speculative design, and what forms of public engagement exactly am I talking about? So in the slide here you can see a device called the plane tracker. This is taking a transmission of an aeroplane as it flies overhead, and then it's finding out where the airplane is traveling. It's then using that to look up the path on Google Earth, and it's kind of doing a representation of the flight path, if you like. And you can see that device has been deployed in someone's house here. Now, what was interesting about their experience of that is that whereas the flight used to be perhaps a nuisance, just a kind of a noise of the plane going overhead, they then had this kind of new view onto the aircraft. So here's what Bill Gaver has to say about this technology. He's suggesting that instead of kind of designing solutions for particular needs, technologies can kind of go into environments, and they can help people kind of reflect on their relationships with the world around them through these technologies. So there, I think it's really interesting that he's not saying that we're solving specific problems, but rather these technologies become situated into social contexts, and they help us consider our relationship with what's going on. So a second piece of work that I'd like to show is Tony Dunn and Fiona Rabies' placebo project. Now again, these devices, and they describe them as kind of poetic prototypes, are designed for users who are electrosensitive. So these are, again, going into these domestic spaces, and there's a platform here that obviously is including the prototypes and also the photography. And here's what Dunn and Rabies say about this work. They're suggesting that these design proposals could be used as a medium to stimulate discussion amongst the public, designers, and industry. So, like Gaver's work, technology is being put into situations where it's helping people kind of reflect upon their relationships with technologies. But perhaps more than that, what they're kind of anticipating with this work is that these are kind of public situations rather than academic situations. So, moving away now from this kind of idea of speculative design into forms of public engagement. Public engagement in the UK, in Europe, and across the rest of the world has been a kind of policy concern for some time. And here's a kind of a statement from a UK politician on a version of public engagement, if you like. Now, what he's suggesting here is that scientists need to kind of talk about their work with the public, so that there's this kind of element of trust and an element of belief in the value of these technologies that are being produced. Now, this is a kind of a particular form of public engagement, if you like. It's been described as the deficit model. So what we have here is a kind of a straight trajectory in development of the technology, and then by, of course, kind of educating and talking to the public, they gain the kind of confidence and belief, and it's a shared value in the kind of the success going forward in what this technology achieves. So there's a kind of a top-down view, I guess, of what public engagement might be. More recently, people have been talking about upstream forms of engagement. So these are situations where technologies are discussed at a much earlier stage in the development. And an example there is a project in a nanotechnology lab in Cambridge that was led by a geographer called Robert Doubleday. And here's what Doubleday had to say about the work. He says that my role is to help imagine what the social dimensions of that technology, of nanotechnology, might be, even though those eventual applications of the science, they're not quite clear yet. So this idea of public engagement in a kind of upstream context is that way before products and services are kind of merging into markets, then you're kind of thinking about the social implications of that material. So with material beliefs, what I'm asking you to really consider is how these speculative approaches to design come together with these public engagement formats. And the way that material beliefs did that, or the way it situated that, was within biotechnology labs. And there were relationships that were developed with 4 laboratories. And I'm going to kind of focus on one of those labs today and tell you about what happened there. So what is it about these spaces? What's going on within the Institute that I'll tell you more about? And what do non-experts make of these technologies as they come into those environments? So this is a Biotechnology Institute at a London university. And here's what the director of research there has to say about the work that goes on there. So he's saying that these silicon technologies are getting smaller, and the understanding of biological systems are getting better. So this is an interdisciplinary space, life sciences, physics, chemistry, and engineering. And these sorts of competencies are coming together in what the director describes as hybrid devices. So in terms of hybridity, this is bringing together interfaces between the silicon and tissues. And here's a photograph of some of the silicon that's coming out of the Institute. It's designed in-house, but it's kind of fabricated out of house. And you can see on the right there an image of that same device in a CAD program. And these are really labs on a chip, if you like. There's 17 different projects going on within that silicon, and then it's exposed in different ways to achieve different applications. So if you look down to the bottom right there, literally in the far corner of the bottom right there, that's an artificial pancreas. So on one end of that device is some sensors that's measuring blood sugar levels. That's being looked at by an algorithm within the silicon, and then that's controlling the delivery of insulin. So you're having kind of a closed loop system for the treatment of type 2 diabetes. So here's a kind of a later iteration of that system. It's a kind of digital pancreas laid out on a bench, if you like. And it's very interesting. It's taking data from a patient, and it's kind of abstracting that in this kind of it's a virtual person on the bench there. And it was interesting to invite others into this research environment to talk about this technology. So this was a conversation that happened between 3 people. Ros was a patient. Pantelis, who you can see there, was an engineer working on the device, working on making this device work. There's also Nick, who was a doctor. Who was a doctor and a researcher, particularly interested in diabetes. So in contrast to this kind of engineering model that we've just seen of the disease, Ross was putting forward an experiential version of that same disease. She was talking about how she needed to trust the technology she was using. She was talking about the emotions associated with using that technology in public spaces. And interestingly, she was talking about the management of data. As the technologies kind of improve, it becomes a huge amount of data is generated, and how does she kind of negotiate that? So there were these 2 views on this same technology, a kind of an embodied emotional view of that technology and a kind of engineering scheme. This is a kind of a second encounter, if you like, within that lab. These are design students. They're always interested in new technologies, but how they usually work is to kind of kick off the briefs with a kind of internet-based research, I guess. So here was an opportunity at a really early stage to kind of expose these students to the kind of mundane practices of that lab environment. So they're kind of coming in and they're getting a real sense of what is going on there. And it was interesting because there was a kind of a skepticism to the stories that the engineers were telling about their work. For example, there was suspicion about how the data being produced within the kind of these biomedical environments might be misused. And the researcher who was making an implant that was looking at blood pressure levels was surprised by these alternative views that the students were having. And she's commenting here on one of the students who was suggesting a kind of as a scenario where the patient might be monitored by an insurance company, and if that patient was unhealthy, had an unhealthy lifestyle, then the premium from their insurance would kind of go up. So it's this kind of interesting situation where there's the trajectory that the technology is taking, and there's these alternative concerns and these kind of alternative values that are coming together within this lab environment. So these conversations then lead into tangible objects. They're materialized into these kind of speculative designs, if you like. So I'll talk a little bit about one of those called vital signs. The digital plaster is another application that's coming out of the Institute. And you can see here the chaps putting a plaster on. This has a silicon in the plaster, and what it's doing is measuring his blood pressure levels. And you can see he's kind of watching what his body's doing on his mobile phone there. He's kind of watching the performance of his body. And naturally, that's going out across a network, so you're getting remote healthcare also within this example. So this is a kind of a view of the research that the scientists and the engineers are showing to potential investors and in academic settings. But I think what's interesting about these biotechnologies and what we've seen already with the students' concerns and the students' kind of articulations there is that the technology is taken up by others and it's used to express or to take on their concerns. And here's an example of that. These are some slides from a documentary called Cotton Wool Kids. And this is all about the mother's concern for her child's safety as she plays in a public space. And I'm just going to show a short clip from that film. It's just a minute long. And this has some sound, please.
With the technology, I believe that will be available in the next year. I would say within a, say, 20-kilometre radius, then you would be able to locate it just like that.
She's, say, on a railway track or, in town somewhere or, and you've told her not to go, then at least then you could see where she was and you think, little Madden.
You could provide a sort of virtual fence. So when she goes outside a certain area, or if she goes into a certain place you don't want her to go to, then you could at home have this red light flashing.
And say, back.
She said, well, yeah, I would feel that's going a bit too far.
I'd be the first to get it done.
Right, well, once in place, then straight away we would be able to test it out, and the picture, as we see there, we'd probably test out with Abby, and you can sit here with me and we can see where she goes and what she does.
It's a deterrent. So,
feel a little bit safer, a little bit more secure.
Yeah, can relax a bit more, and she could relax a bit more as well.
Okay, so Vital Signs took the digital plaster as a kind of back end, a platform, if you like, and it then looked to materialise the concerns that were being expressed by this mother here. So what you've got is a plaster being worn by a child that is kind of broadcasting biometric data across a network, and then it's being embodied in these devices here. So on the lower left there, you can see this is displaying heart rate. It's LEDs with a heart rate. The device in the middle is a kind of pedometer. It's moving from side to side with the child's footsteps. And then the object on the right is a virtual lung. It's rising and falling as her daughter is breathing. So I think it's important that these aren't, in terms of the way that these formats become rendered, they're not just ideas, but it's important to kind of follow them through because of the conversations that you have with others along the way. So this is really just to give you a quick idea of how these platforms were were put together. And there's as often as possible, open source tools are used. Arduino, which has been mentioned, was used for the coding. This is controlling the movement of the devices and the display on the LEDs. These are using also Bluetooth modules, so they're getting data in, the communications are coming in over Bluetooth. The circuit boards, the printed circuit boards, were made in a program called Eagle, and the cases for the objects were made in a CAD environment called Rhino, and the kind of rapid prototyped to make the cases for the objects. So as well as the kind of prototypes that are as functional as possible, there's also kinds of sets of scenario photography that kind of accompany this object, if you like. So here's a kind of a setting of how these devices might be used. I worked with my friend Tash and her son Jaden, and it's kind of a recreation or a scenario that goes out with the prototypes, if you like. So the speculative design is a kind of format that includes the photography, it includes the devices, and then it's going out into kind of other kind of situations, into public settings. And I'll just show a couple of examples of those settings now. So this first public event is an exhibition. It's a product design exhibition in northern Spain. And I guess what's going on here, frequently the point being made by the designs that would be on show in an environment like this are kind of aesthetic points, or they're material points, or it's an issue about perhaps semantics of the product. But here what these designs are bringing into this environment is a kind of, they're situating these technologies or these materials in social environments. They're asking social questions about the technologies. But I think there's something interesting going on there, and this is particularly in terms of if we are to think of these exhibitions as formats for engagement. What exactly do we mean by that, and what kinds of engagements go on within those environments? And this is just some reflection on that from one of the designers. And so what he's saying that he's wondering what the exhibition does. He's saying that perhaps you have an opening and there's lots of people, lots of kind of vibrancy at that one event, and perhaps someone might learn something about something which they haven't come across before. But then, of course, his concern is that afterwards, what happens? What happens to the work once you're not there to perhaps discuss it? And so this, for me, is just really a question about what this work accomplishes. I'm just interested, really, in what these kinds of exhibitions are. Are they dissemination rather than engagement, for example? This second setting is at a building called the Dana Centre in London. And this is a kind of, the format for this evening is a café scientifique. And this is, the idea here is that you're having a kind of informal discussion with scientists about technology. You're having a drink, talking about how the technology works, for example. But I guess what's going on here is that alongside the engineers and the scientists who have a very clear idea of where their research is going, there's also designers and other kinds of views in on the technology, these kind of like these speculations, these alternatives. So these sorts of views on the things are coming together, and it's encouraging a debate not just about the kind of the scientific facts, if you like, of these devices, but of how they might go out and what might play out in public spaces. So I just want to pick up on a couple of quotes there. This is kind of a general response from this chap here about the approach within the evening. He's talking about how these technologies can be used to question culture. The second quote here, it's about a piece of work that I haven't had a chance to show you that's about kind of extending life. And she's really concerned here that, of course, if populations go on and if people are living longer, then kind of we're running out of resources. So it's just to kind of to point out the kinds of discussions that are happening in these kinds of events. It's not just about the technology, but about the implications of that stuff once it go out into social settings. Okay, so I just kind of draw things together quickly here for you. And of course, I started off with the idea of bringing non-experts into the labs and of having these kinds of conversations in the lab environment. So, what's actually going on there and what's perhaps interesting about that? Well, these environments are all about making stuff work and of doing things within tight deadlines. So they're closing down and they're stabilizing the idea of what the patient is, what data is, and what the technology does. So, of course, alongside that, what I'm suggesting is that the lab can become a site where other kinds of knowledge are brought in. And these knowledges are kind of embodying the experience of people who aren't necessarily experts within these fields. So alongside this kind of path that the technology is hopefully taking, patients, the data, these things are also, they're contested and they're opened up. And then what do these designs do? Well, they're coming out of this process of discussion, and they're incorporating other formats. It's not just the kind of the information that's coming out of the research context, but they're bringing in other material, and I've mentioned there a film. They're also bringing in journalism and also product design language. Also tied into these prototypes are the identities and the motivations of users. And so what we're seeing here is a kind of reformatting of the technology that are supporting these kind of alternative dimensions. So these objects that go out and are exhibited and go into other kind of environments, they materialize and they're making vivid these alternative contexts. And they're kind of challenging models of care that might be seen as kind of top-down models of how these technologies develop. So finally, the kind of places that this stuff then goes, I mentioned that because it's associated with this design context, they're going into these networks of exhibitions where they're trying to emphasize the social. And I kind of drew a line under that. I was curious about what they actually kind of achieved there. Perhaps more interestingly, they're going into these kind of public engagement contexts, the Café Scientifique that we saw. And they're kind of presenting alternatives, vivid alternatives that generate discussion. And of course, it's not just these kind of big events. They're also part of a larger kind of range of materials, of news media, of online formats. And this is a kind of really an interesting network that's kind of reminding us, and this is the point I'm trying to make, going back to the opening slide about the views of technology that it happens in labs and then comes out into the world. This is, of course, not the case. Technologies in society are never independent. They always happen together, and hopefully that's a point that the work is making.
Thank you, Tobie.
Okay, thank you.
Now, talking about different interpretations, I couldn't help when I was looking at the little film, when I saw the doctor smiling at the mother and saying, okay, you can send her now and you can sit with me. I was more worried for the mother than for the child for some reason. So you see that this is also open for interpretations. Now, maybe one of the questions there is that when you look at that, you see that, at least that's the interpretation we got, that public engagement is more than just about ethics and the interaction with society. It actually might help the research bring also more marketable products that are more likely to succeed. How actually interested are biotech companies, pharmaceutical companies, companies in other areas of healthcare in what you're doing? Are they actually coming to you and asking you to send designers and laymen into their labs, or is that still a little early?
Well, there's a whole range of things going on there, I think. I mean, I sort of mentioned that there's perhaps two formats for public engagement, a kind of top-down model, if you like, and then this thing that I was describing as upstream engagement. So, of course, where the scientists and the engineers that we were working with see themselves within that, there's a whole range of stuff going on there as well. Sometimes they're just interested in seeing how the kind of knowledges that they hold so dear translate into kind of cultural environments. Sometimes they're doing it because they believe They're coming to us because they believe that they want to educate people. They really want people to learn about what they find fascinating about the materials. So I think there's a whole range of things going on there. And certainly, in terms of who comes forward, there's always different motives for why someone might do that. And of course, not everyone wants to get involved in public engagement.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tobie.